Hi, I'm John DeSteiger, the president of Oklahoma Christian University. We have countless exciting speakers that come to campus, and I am thrilled that we have Peggy Grande with us today. Peggy's going to be speaking later tonight to what I know will be a packed crowd in the Adams Recital Hall. Peggy has a great story, and she worked very closely with some very, very special people. You'll learn more about that. Peggy, it's a real honor to have you on campus this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, I want to go back to the very beginning. Maybe not the very beginning, but so where did you grow up? And you ended up at Pepperdine, and how did that happen? And then I want to talk about how you found this job that is just so exciting.
Yeah. Well, I was born and raised in Southern California, and so an Orange County girl originally, and then moved to LA for college. But I was always that nerdy little kid that loved presidents and politics and government and the White House. And you know how some kids get fixated on something, and I don't know exactly where that fascination came from, but it was insatiable. And checking out every book in the library that I could, never knowing that my life would intersect this world. More of a hobby, something that I looked at from afar. Went to Pepperdine, was a communications major, a minor in business. Again, still never thought that the political arena would be something for me. And but Ronald Reagan then was the great communicator in the White House, and as a communications major, I studied him very carefully and just was fascinated by him. So in him was this perfect embodiment of everything I loved, a person of value and faith and communication and the president.
Right.
Just fascinated by him.
So President Reagan served as president from 1980 to 88.
He did.
And the Presidential Library then came to be not far from the Pepperdine campus.
Yeah.
And so tell us about this role that you learned about and then applied for that really served President Reagan and Nancy in a very, very special way.
Yeah. So Ronald Reagan left the White House in January of 1989,
Right.
And he set up a post-presidential office in West LA in a little area called Century City, not far from his house, and that was where his post-presidential office would be. He had a small staff, so he had left the White House, which had a staff of hundreds, if not thousands, and there was really just a handful of people that served him in the post-presidency. So I knew that he had an office across town, and again, with this fascination of presidents, I just thought if I could work any place in LA, I would work for him. I was a graduating senior. I was in my final semester. I was actually graduating a semester early, and thankfully I was raised by an incredible man of faith and an incredible man of optimism, and my dad taught me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. And I believed him, and I took a chance, and I wrote a letter to the office of Ronald Reagan and was brought in for an interview, never imagining anything would come of it. And I actually thought, if this is the only opportunity I have, I'm going to take this moment to just soak in the surroundings of this office and this place and remember every moment.
Okay, so wait a minute. So there was not an open position that you were applying for. You actually, you stepped out and said, hey, President Reagan.
Yeah.
You need
I
me.
was that crazy.
That's great.
Took the little initiative and just said, somebody's got to work there, right? And, you know, when you're volunteering, I thought, you know, maybe they need volunteers. So I was brought in. I interviewed for what I thought would be a short-term internship as I was graduating, and was hired basically on the spot for a short-term internship. And at the end of my internship, they offered me a full-time staff position. The woman who had hired me actually returned to Washington, D.C., and they asked me to take her role. She was the executive assistant to the chief of staff at the time. And so I served in that capacity for about 2 or 3 years. And then Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant he had had since before he was governor retired. And they asked me to take that job.
Wow.
And that's not something you say no to, but I was 6 months pregnant with my first baby and wasn't quite sure how I was going to navigate that space. And so fast forward 10 years of my life were spent in that office, serving that iconic man sitting right outside his office door, handling the day-to-day operations, everything from phone calls and correspondence to incredible visitors that came through the office and travel.
So you saw President Reagan and Nancy, his wife, in such an intimate setting on a daily basis.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm sure you're aware of this. Governor Reagan had good connections with Pepperdine University
Yes.
in its early days
Yeah.
as well. And so that's kind of neat, that connection as well.
Very influential and I think helpful in, getting the campus there in Malibu established and moved from
right.
LA. So yeah, some longtime roots there. And it was wonderful to see these people when the cameras weren't rolling, when they thought nobody was watching, and to have that ability to see who they were behind the scenes.
Okay,
And
okay, I want to ask about
Okay.
that because I have very positive perceptions of the Reagans, and you're really Oklahoma. You're in Reagan country
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. There's a lot of folks that really love the Reagans and the legacy. So when I think about President Reagan, I think of a strong communicator who had a real strong sense of what was right and what was wrong. And he focused on the big picture and was very effective at that. And I think of Nancy as a very loyal supporter of Ronald, making a lot of things possible for him. So those are my perceptions. Are they close?
Yeah.
Or
I would say that's pretty spot on. Ronald Reagan was probably one of the few people that, regardless of the pedestal you put him on in your mind, he lived up to that and possibly even exceeded it when you were in person. There's so many people we hold in high regard, whether it's a sports hero or a celebrity, and a lot of times you meet them and you're kind of disappointed.
Right.
Ronald Reagan was completely the opposite, and in person he was more kind and more charming and more handsome and just really a good person. Was he a saint? No. Was he perfect? No. But he was a really good man, and time again I saw him behind the scenes do the right thing and honor people who maybe had not been honored by others, recognize and acknowledge people who others would dismiss or overlook, and was just a really incredible man of faith, a man who was grounded in a sense of self. He knew who he was and what he was about and what he was called to do in life. And if you were doing what you were called to do in life, then we were all equal. He really didn't think of himself as better than anybody else.
Wow, what a great tribute. President Reagan witnessed and really presided over some really seismic shifts in our country, but also in the world during his time serving as president. And he made connections with some other really important, maybe generation at a time leaders. Were there special guests that came to see the Reagans following the presidency that you were able to have some connection with as well?
Oh, definitely. Are you asking me to name drop?
Please,
Do
please.
I have permission?
Yeah, okay, all right. Yeah,
They didn't come to see me, of course, but I got to see them.
Who were they, and what were they like?
It was incredible because when you realize that post-presidency, nobody had to come see him for protocol or diplomatic reasons. When you realize that people literally traveled from across the globe to come and shake his hand, you realize that Ronald Reagan's version of diplomacy was very relational. It wasn't based on rhetoric, it wasn't political, it was very personal. And so people came from all over the world to pay tribute and to continue a relationship that they had with him. So everybody from Margaret Thatcher to the Queen to Gorbachev to Prime Minister Nakasone from Japan and the King of Jordan and Chancellor Helmut Kohl and let's see, Lech Walesa from Poland, Mother Teresa.
Man, if you're
from
going to drop,
Calcutta.
if you're going to drop names, you did
And
a
I'm sure
really
I'm
great
forgetting
job.
Brian Mulroney from Canada. But so many came, and when you realize that Ronald Reagan couldn't do anything for them, they came because they were fond of him, and they had a relationship with him that they wanted to continue. And how special and what a great reminder of what diplomacy at its best really looks like. And it's not something handled by the State Department or the Foreign Service. It's something that can be held at the highest level. And I guess one of the things, especially as a young person that was so impressionable at that time and soaking it all in, one of the most surprising things I noticed when you would watch these iconic world leaders interact is Ronald Reagan clearly had a spine of steel. Nobody doubts that he was a strong person. He took on the Soviet Union. He went toe-to-toe with them and challenged them to tear down the wall. But behind that spine of steel was this beautiful humanity and this kindness and this soft, gentle kindness that I guess as a young person especially, I didn't know those two could coexist in one person.
Right.
And to watch that time and time again with these world leaders coming in, they had relationships that in a lot of ways were very normal looking.
Wow. And you just referenced one of those iconic lines from his speech talking to Mikhail Gorbachev about tearing down this wall. And my understanding is that actually the speechwriters didn't put that in, and they kept taking it out, and it was President Reagan who said, no, this is going to be in.
Yeah.
And so he put it in.
Yeah, speechwriters took it out. State Department said it's too confrontational, don't say it. But again, he was a man of vision. He knew where he was headed. He knew what should be done, and really had a vision for not just the nation, but a global leadership in powerful and positive ways. He wanted to shine the torch of freedom to places where oppression existed, and he did that time and time again because he believed that once people got a taste of freedom, they couldn't help but want more. And so thankfully, he went with his instinct and didn't listen to his advisors and said what he wanted to say. And, the world has him to thank for that, because imagine if he didn't. The world would be a very different place.
Did you realize on a daily basis how cool it was to be in the job that you were in?
Yes and no.
Right,
Okay.
right.
Working in the office, of course, was an incredible experience. And as much as I wanted to soak up and savor every single moment, I really had to take those little snapshots in my mind, but I had a job to do.
You had a lot of stuff to do.
And
right.
I not only had to keep pace with him, but I had to keep 10 steps ahead of him. And, if you've ever been around a presidential or even post-presidential office, I mean, things work at a very rapid pace, and there's no margin for error. And so as a very young person, I felt the duty and the obligation of living up to this man's standards and perpetuating the legacy and the reputation that he had built. And so as much as I wanted to savor those moments, I really was always thinking ahead. Okay, we're going to leave in 3 minutes, and I need to grab this and do that and tell this and make sure Secret Service is ready. And
so in some ways, you're an extension of him, and you helped him be more of who he was in all of those kinds of settings.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it took a little getting used to realize that it was okay to interrupt the president because being on time was very important to him. And so if he was in the middle of a meeting and having a lovely conversation, it was a priority for him to stay on schedule. And so to learn as a very young person, excuse me, Mr. President, I'd like to break this up, and to take that initiative. But that was an important part of my job, and making sure that he was always prepared and always looked good. And the preparation was essential so that he could walk into a meeting and feel fully prepared and know who he was meeting with, and just be ready to then enjoy the moment.
Wow, that is great, and what a great lesson. Speaking of courage, I want to ask you about maybe one of the most courageous things that I saw, because I remember on the Sunday morning when I read the open letter from former President Reagan to the nation about his diagnosis of Alzheimer's and beginning that journey.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, it was such a brave and courageous thing for him to talk about that, and really to say goodbye to the American people over time, but especially in that letter.
Yeah. It was so Reagan-esque in the way he handled it. He always was the one who wanted to talk directly to the American people and say what he wanted to say in the way he wanted to say it. And during his presidency, he did it through weekly radio addresses and through calling the cameras into the Oval Office and looking right through the lens and coming into your living room on one of your 3 channels on your dial TV. Yeah. It was important to him to say what he wanted to say directly and not always go through spokespeople. And so even the fact that he put pen to paper and chose to do it in that way was so Reagan-esque. And you mentioned courage. It took a lot of courage for them, and it was something that he and Mrs. Reagan didn't have to do. It was a very private situation. They could have kept it very private. They probably could have gone up to the ranch and let the tabloids write stories and speculate and never really confirmed it. But that wasn't who they were. They used their platform always to help and to benefit and to promote awareness of things that could possibly help other families. And so for them to choose to take something very private and make it public was just so Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And we have them to thank for so much that we know now about Alzheimer's. In fact, looking back, I didn't really know, even when he had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, there was not very much information out there about it. And so I was launching into something that was very uncharted territory as well, and not knowing how to help and support this man who was entering this very difficult and challenging journey ahead. But to your other point, he wrote this letter, and that was 5 years into his post-presidency. And in a lot of ways, the world started saying goodbye to him at that point. But but I was still saying good morning to him every day for the next 5 years. And so even that diagnosis to him was not a death sentence. And he, as a tremendous man of faith, continued on as long as he could, as best as he could. And that was really a powerful statement that he had unfinished business still and wasn't going to accept that as the end.
You know, I've just been reminded as you were talking, when President Reagan did pass away, of course his funeral service was televised, broadcast, and actually we broadcast it on our campus there in our auditorium where Big Chapel occurs every day. It was a special event for a lot of people here that wanted to be a part of that from afar. Peggy, any word of wisdom or insight? I mean, you have had such a great experience that you proactively took advantage of and did. Any words of wisdom or insight or advice for students who might be watching this interview?
Yeah. Well, I hope they'll take my dad's advice and realize that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. And I wrote a book last year about my experiences. It's called The President Will See You Now, My Stories and Lessons from Ronald Reagan's Final Years. And it really details the journey of a very young woman. And I tell my story alongside the president's because not everybody can relate to being president of the United States, but everybody will relate to one part or another of my story. And I hope that anybody who reads it would find in the pages of the book that I was young and green and naive in so many ways and stepping into a place that seemed far too big and far too foreign. And I think that a lot of your students maybe feel that daunting feeling of, I don't know if I'm going to belong there. I don't know if I'm ever going to add value or be able to contribute. And yet my story is one that I'm an ordinary girl who was thrown into an extraordinary position with an extraordinary man, and yet somehow you find your way and you find your footing, and this space that seemed far too big, eventually I felt like I was a good contributor to that space and that I did belong there and I did add value. And then the last part of the book really details the fact that life throws you curveballs, and just when you're feeling kind of confident and kind of good, mastery, I've got this, life throws you curveballs, and what do you do about that? And so in Ronald Reagan's case, it was a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And in my case, it was working for this iconic man that all of a sudden had a diagnosis that I felt very ill-equipped to handle and to support him through. I didn't know enough about it. I was young. I was, juggling toddlers at home and dealing with this very aging elderly man. Did I have within me the strength and the fortitude to see him through? And so I hope that young people will realize that they're stronger than they think. They can do it all, and especially when you're called to be someplace, God will give you everything you need, because there were many times I felt completely ill-equipped to be there, but I always trusted that God, for some reason, has plucked this girl from obscurity and dropped her at the feet of greatness, and if our God has chosen to do that, He'll give me everything I need to be there.
Wow, what great insight and advice, and what a great life that Peggy has enjoyed. I love her dad's advice. Somebody is going to get the job that you want to have. It might as well be you. And we don't know what's coming, but God will help see us through. Peggy, you've been a real blessing. Thanks for your enthusiasm and your verve, and we are so honored to have you on campus
It's my
today.
pleasure. Thank you so much.
God bless you.